You feel like everything has gotten more expensive, don't you? Bread at the bakery, the electric bill, cooking gas. It seems like your money isn't worth anything anymore. And what if I told you that it's not just your imagination, but the result of a perfect storm that started back in 2020 and still hasn't ended? In the next few minutes, you're going to find out how the pandemic, a war in Europe, and corporate decisions turned the world into a place where even turning on the lights has become a luxury for over 1 billion people. Let's go back to the beginning of 2020. The whole world went into lockdown. Factories in China shut their doors, ships sat idle in ports, planes stopped flying. The production chains that connected countries and continents simply broke apart. Meanwhile, governments panicked and did what seemed obvious. They threw money at the economy. Trillions of dollars, euros, and reais in stimulus packages, emergency aid, and easy credit. The idea was simple: keep people spending to avoid an economic depression. But no one imagined what would happen once everything started working again. When economies reopened in 2021, there was a lot of money circulating in people's hands, but very few products available. Think of it like an auction, where 100 people are trying to buy only 10 products. What happens? Prices explode. And that's exactly what we saw. Global inflation, which was just 2.2% in 2019, jumped to an astonishing 8.3% in 2022. To put it in perspective, that was the highest inflation spike in decades. The International Monetary Fund estimated that in the third quarter of 2022, global inflation reached 9.4%. It was as if the entire world was on fire at the same time. But the story was only just beginning. And what came next made everything even worse. If you want to help me keep making these videos, please consider subscribing to the channel and hit the like button. It motivates and helps me keep bringing videos in this format. February 24th, 2022. That date was marked as the day Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border. You might be thinking, what does a war in Europe have to do with my electric bill here in Brazil? The answer is absolutely everything. Russia and Ukraine together were responsible for 1/4 of all wheat exported in the world. Russia was also the world's second largest supplier of natural gas. Suddenly, those flows were cut off. Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea were blocked. The gas pipelines that carried Russian energy to Europe were shut down. The impact was devastating. In Europe, the price of natural gas, which cost a modest 8.5 euro cents per kilowatt-hour in October 2021, skyrocketed to 16.5 cents by September 2022. That's nearly double the price in less than a year. In Europe's energy market, prices hit absurd peaks of 339 euros per megawatt-hour in August 2022 when, before the pandemic, they hovered around just 12.9 euros. Imagine your power bill multiplied by 26 times. In the United Kingdom, the situation became so critical that in April 2022, the government had to raise the energy price cap by 54%. Even with government subsidies partially protecting families, household bills rose 42% compared to the previous winter. Millions of Britons had to choose between heating their homes or buying food. And this didn't happen only in Europe. The domino effect spread worldwide, because when Europeans started buying liquefied gas from other suppliers, prices went up globally. Meanwhile, agricultural markets were in total chaos. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization reported that its global food price index hit a record high in March 2022. Wheat, corn, vegetable oils, everything soared. Poor countries that relied on those imports saw hunger spread. And just when you think you've seen it all, there's another layer to this story. This is where the narrative gets truly disturbing. Throughout this entire crisis, while families cut expenses and workers saw their wages lose purchasing power, some corporations were making more profit than ever. In the United States, a report from the Groundwork Collaborative revealed something shocking. Between April and September 2023, 53% of inflation was driven by corporate profits. That's right, more than half of the price increases had nothing to do with higher production costs. Input costs rose only 1%, but consumer prices increased 3.4%. What does that mean in practice? It means many companies took advantage of the crisis to boost their profit margins. They used inflation as an excuse to pass on price hikes far beyond what was necessary. While workers lost purchasing power, the shareholders of those corporations watched their dividends grow. The International Labor Organization documented that real wage growth in 2024 was only 2.7% and extremely uneven. In low-income countries, 22% of workers earned less than half the median wage. Inequality was laid bare. Amnesty International pointed out that the poorest half of humanity holds just 2% of global wealth. Meanwhile, billionaires increased their fortunes during the pandemic and the energy crisis. The feeling of injustice wasn't just psychological, it was mathematically proven. And when people realized that, they took to the streets. But there's a side of this crisis that almost no one talks about, and it might be the most terrifying one. Have you ever stopped to think about what it means to not have reliable electricity in the 21st century? A World Bank study revealed something that sounds impossible. 1.18 billion people live in areas so dark at night that satellites can't detect any electricity use. That's 60% more than the 733 million officially recorded as lacking access to electricity. The difference? These people technically have a grid connection, but they live in darkness. Another 447 million have an electrical connection, but simply can't use power either, because the grid is too unstable, constantly failing, or because the cost has become prohibitive. Imagine living on a street with wires and poles, but being unable to turn on a light because the price per kilowatt hour eats up half your salary. This happens in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and parts of Latin America. Places where the cost of living crisis isn't an inconvenience, it's a matter of survival. Energy isn't just about lighting. It's about being able to cook without wood that causes respiratory diseases. It's about keeping food and vaccines refrigerated. It's about children being able to study at night. It's about local businesses being able to operate. When energy becomes inaccessible, entire societies move backward. And it's happening right now, as you listen to this script, in dozens of countries. The energy crisis has created a new category of poverty, energy poverty, and it's growing. And if you think this doesn't affect your life here, think again. Because this crisis has cultural consequences that reach even the wealthiest nations. In the United Kingdom, 90% of the population said they were worried about the rising cost of living. But only 16% believed they could get through the crisis without making drastic changes. And where did those changes show up first? In culture? Theaters, museums, music festivals, art galleries all faced a perfect storm. Operating costs skyrocketed, especially energy to light and climate control venues. Staff wages had to be adjusted for inflation. And the public, with less money in their pockets, cut spending on tickets, pre-show meals, and intermission drinks. Festivals were canceled in 2022 and 2023 because organizers simply couldn't balance the books. Small theater companies closed their doors. Independent artists saw their fees shrink or disappear entirely. And here's the problem. Culture isn't superfluous. Culture is what makes us human, it's how we collectively process our challenges, where we create shared meaning. When culture collapses, something essential in society is lost. The report on the cost of living crisis in the arts, culture, and heritage sectors warned that British cultural institutions would need 10% more funding just to maintain wages in 2024. But where would that money come from? Private philanthropy also shrank. Tax incentives like the theater tax relief were hard to access for small organizations. The result was massive precarization. Artists facing expensive rent, no funding, cutting their fees just to keep working. Culture, which should be a public good, became endangered because financial survival turned into the absolute priority. And while theaters were shutting down in London, on the streets of dozens of countries, revolt was growing. In 2022, the Political Risk Index by consultancy WTW recorded something unprecedented. 3 million person days were spent protesting the cost of living across 122 countries. To grasp that scale, imagine that on each of those days, 1,000 people left their homes, their jobs, their routines, to take to the streets and demand change. This happened in wealthy nations like France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, where strong unions saw their members' purchasing power evaporate quickly. But it also happened in poor countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where food inflation meant literal hunger. Amnesty International documented that between January and November 2022, protests over inflation and economic hardship skyrocketed worldwide. Many governments' response wasn't to tackle the roots of the crisis, it was repression. Excessive police force, arrests of demonstrators, criminalization of social protest. As if silencing voices could make hunger and poverty disappear. In sub-Saharan Africa, where food prices rose 24% between 2020 and 2022, average inflation hit 18.5% in 2023. Imagine your salary losing nearly 1/5 of its value in a single year. The Russian invasion of Ukraine pushed an additional 93 million people into extreme poverty. Combined with the pandemic's effects, 200 million more people have faced food insecurity since 2020. And 828 million people regularly go hungry. These aren't just numbers. They're lives, their children stunted by malnutrition, their broken families, their stolen futures. And the anger this creates doesn't disappear when inflation drops a little. But there's another factor in this equation that makes everything more complex and more dangerous. The war in Ukraine wasn't the only geopolitical factor fueling the crisis. While Europe dealt with the shortage of Russian gas, tensions in the Middle East drove oil prices up again in 2024 and 2025. Houthi militia attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea made freight more expensive and disrupted supply chains between Asia and Europe. The crisis in Gaza added instability. Production cuts coordinated by OPEC Plus kept prices high, and every increase in oil translates into global inflation because oil powers trucks, ships, planes, the entire logistics system. At the same time, the technological rivalry between the United States and China led countries to reconfigure their production chains. Protectionist industrial policies, export restrictions on chips and semiconductors, trade tariffs, all of this makes production more expensive and less efficient. The globalization that had lowered prices for decades began to reverse. And there's a growing consensus among economists: the world has entered an era of recurring shocks. Health, climate, geopolitical, and technological crises are no longer exceptions, they're the new normal. The International Monetary Fund warned that even though inflation is falling, supply disruptions caused by climate, health, and political tensions will become increasingly frequent. And that brings us to a factor few are taking seriously. Climate change is already affecting prices.